Hello, I'm Rich Poirier, the President and CEO of Church Mutual Insurance. I would like to welcome all faith leaders joining us today. It is a pleasure and an honor to address all of you, leaders in your houses of worship and in your communities. As the leader of an insurance carrier, I think about risks all day. That's an important part of my role. Some risks are obvious: accidents, incidents, fire, hail, hurricanes, and the like. But some organizational risks are not so obvious. So they are harder to see. We're dealing with one of those risks today, the health risk impacting faith leaders who are running on empty. According to data released by the Pew Research Center in March, roughly 1 out of 5 adults in the United States is experiencing high levels of psychological distress. This research illustrates that the congregations and groups you support still are reeling from the impact of the pandemic, social isolation, financial strain, and mental health struggles. Often, they turn to you for support. But where can you turn? Today's discussion features 3 incredible experts who will talk about the impact of the pandemic on faith leaders' mental and emotional health. Our goal today is quite simple. It is to provide you with resources to help you recognize your own health struggles and navigate to a better state. Even more important, we hope to convince you to take care of yourself first so you can better take care of your flock. In times of crisis, you are not alone. In addition to the faith that sustains you, it is important to find strength and support in the colleagues and peers sharing your experiences. We consider it both an honor and a privilege to help you do that. We encourage you to join us for future webinars that will address feelings of guilt and other mental health issues affecting you and your colleagues. It is an honor to present these webinars in partnership with the Duke Divinity School Office of Black Church Studies and the Balm and Gilead. Together, let's remove any stigma from focusing on mental and emotional health, and let's commit to better health in general so we can be our very best for our families, congregations, and communities. And now, I am pleased to welcome Dr. David Gottlieb, Director of Duke Divinity School, Office of Black Church Studies. Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks, Rich. We appreciate this opportunity to partner with Church Mutual and with Balm and Gilead. I'm David Emmanuel Gottlieb. I teach theology and Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School, and also have the privilege of being the director of our Office of Black Church Studies. I've had a lot of experience over the years working with congregations and congregational leaders in the aftermath of large-scale disasters. And one of the things that we find time and time again is that pastoral leaders, because of their love of God and love of neighbor, spend a lot of time and energy and effort caring for others. And sometimes caring for themselves is put way on the back burner if it's on the stove at all. And so we want to encourage pastoral leaders to, as you care for others, to also care for yourselves. And this is something that is good stewardship, and we rejoice to partner to bring a number of conversations with thought leaders to help us think through ways of being good and faithful to God and to neighbor, but also to self. We're pleased to join together, and I'm happy to present to you our colleague, Dr. Pernessa Steele from Balm in Gilead. Dr. Steele.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And to all of you, we are the Balm in Gilead. We are so excited to be a part of this very, very, very important collaboration. You know, the struggle is real. The struggle is real, but God's grace is sufficient. And the first good thing today is that you've taken the time to be a part of this important conversation. There are so many things that we could be doing right now, but just the fact that you have taken the time to just be still and partake of that which have been prepared for you. Indeed, there is a balm in Gilead. And we are just ecstatic that we are part of this. And thank you for including us in this very important conversation. Remember, accept the fact that the struggle is real, but God's grace is always sufficient. And thank you for taking the time to take care of yourself in this moment. God bless you.
Thank you, Ms. Poirier. Thank you, Dr. Goatley, and thank you, Dr. Steele, for your introductory remarks. My name is Guy Russ. I serve the Church Mutual Insurance Company policyholders as the Assistant Vice President of Risk Control. I'm also happy to say that I serve on several boards and committees of organizations that are policyholders. And in those roles, I work to support faith leaders just like yourselves. And so I'm very much looking forward to our conversations here today to hear what our speakers can help us with, both as yourself as a faith leader, but also as someone who's in a congregation and organizations that work to also support those leaders for our organizations. So just to give you an idea of what today looks like, we've divided the session up into two major parts. In the first part, I'll introduce each of our panelists and give them a moment to give us a little bit of their background and experience and answer several questions about what they've done in the past and what they bring to the table for today. During that time, you can be thinking of questions that you would like to ask our panelists. And in the second half of our session, we'll take those questions live and we'll look at them from the Q&A inside of the Zoom window that you have. So you can do that by clicking the Q&A button in the Zoom controls. Most of the time, that's near the bottom of your screen. And you can enter any question that you have for the panelists. Again, we'll save those for the second half, but please feel free to enter them whenever you think about them. So without further ado, we're going to start with our first panelist today, Ms. Sheila Battle. I'll turn it over to you, Sheila, for an intro, and then I've got some questions for you.
Thanks, Guy. What an honor it is to be here with you all today. My name is Sheila Battle, and my home is affectionately referred to as the Battle Station. And while here, we live in open community. Pre-COVID, we lived in open community in the Central Virginia area. Our home is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to our community, and we are a resource provider. And I am the executive director of the Soul Care Academy, where your soul is safe. And I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, Sheila, so much for that. And thank you for being here. My first question for you really is if you could please define and describe soul care.
Yeah, so soul care for us, as we defined it here at the Academy, is the strategic yet grace-filled idea that evidence-based practices from psychology and the secular world can be effectively blended with spiritual formation to help restore mental health and emotional wellness while becoming spiritually mature. And so what we do is we walk alongside. It's the greatest work that we do here. We do intake and assessment just like a clinician would, and then we formulate a plan and a path for that person that aids in their emotional wellness.
Thank you, Sheila. That sounds like amazing work. Tell us, why is soul care essential to wholeness?
Yeah, so right now, there's been like a lot of gaming around these words, right? So self-care is the buzzword, not necessarily soul care. But we subscribe to soul care because it's a deeper dive. And the intention is that you bring your faith confession into the work, that it's not just clinical psychology, but that you bring all of the elements that make up your faith with you so that you have a holistic result. And so that's why we don't deny self-care. We believe that self-care is important, and we believe that that's stimulus-based, but a soul care approach is more foundational and it's more spiritual and it helps ground you.
Thank you for that. And I have to say that's been, I think, an area too that I've taken a look at in terms of the whole self, right? Looking at physical, mental, but spiritual as well, being a vital component of that, really. And you can't address any of the other sections without addressing all three or all of them together. Thank you for that. And you already gave us a little bit of an idea of the relationship between soul care and self-care, but what if we introduce the term self-love? That's another one that's kind of out there. Are there any other differences or other characteristics there as that relates to soul care?
Honestly, I think self-care and soul care are rooted in the development and the nurturing of self-love. I think right now, folks have been having such a hard time that self-love hasn't been a priority. I think we've just been in survival mode, and these practices and these ideas help bring people back to self, help remind them that you have to fill up your own cup first, and that once you do that, you are more powerful, you are more effective for those that you serve. So yeah, I think the self-love grows and is nurtured by the combination of both.
I think that is so true. And when I think about our spiritual leaders, and certainly the ones that I interact with, they are so selfless in the way that they think about their roles, right? They're really focused so much on the people they care for that I can see that many times they put themselves on the back burner, like you said, and they're not realizing some of that damage that's occurring to themselves, and that needs to be addressed as well. So how can we allow the areas of our souls to be restored then, knowing the importance of that?
Well, I think what my title for this portion was, it's okay to say no. And so just learning how to say no is one of those critical steps. We teach that no is a complete sentence, and that once you say it, it can stand alone, it can stand for itself. And so being able to think clearly about what is mine to do, what is my work to do, what is assigned to my hands to do, and what can I relinquish and let go? And taking that pause in between to make that decision is absolutely critical. And so we want to encourage people that if you have a demanding schedule, if you have all of these plates spinning at the same time, that you not only learn how to say no, but that you also learn how to build recovery into your weekly schedule, your daily schedule, and your spiritual practice. There has to be time set aside for refilling. And so learning how to say no and learning how to recover would be two critical things that, especially for this audience, that I think would be helpful.
I agree with you too, so much there. And I'm a big fan of Dr. Stephen Covey, the author of The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one phrase that sticks in my mind and that comes back to me when we were talking about that it's okay to say no is one of those phrases he uses in his book is it's easy to say no when there's a deeper yes burning within, right? And that idea of I'm saying yes to caring for myself so that I can care for others. But sometimes that means I have to say no to something else that's asking for my time, right? If I haven't done that work of my own soul care, how can I care for someone else?
Absolutely. Taking that deeper dive gives you room to figure out what that bigger yes is. And that's that space of grace that we operate from.
Thank you so much, Sheila. We'll be back to you, I'm sure, for some questions from the audience as those come in. So now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Reverend Donna Battle. Reverend, would you please give us a little of your background? And then I've got some questions for you as well.
Hi, I'm Donna Battle. I am consulting faculty at Divinity School, and I also serve in parish ministry. I pastor people without a pastor in many cases, but I also coach a lot of leaders and pastors and do a lot of spiritual direction.
Wonderful. Well, welcome to the panel. Thank you so much for your time today. My first question for you is, are there ways that we may limit our understanding of grief that impacts our ability to grieve in a healthy way?
Yes, so grief is such a complex thing, right? So grief is at its base level, acute pain that accompanies loss. And we experience loss in so many ways that we don't always name it as grief. And it's grief upon grief upon grief. And so we can have this really deep rooted grief with the loss of someone that we love, but that's not the only grief that we have. But what's so amazing about what happens when grief comes is grief kind of makes us stop. It's like waking up in a storm and seeing that you want to get out of the storm, but every way out of the storm requires you to go through the storm, right? And so we want to avoid the pain, and rather than going through the storm, we just stop. And as leaders, we feel like we don't have time to stop in the way that grief requires. But I'm reminded in this moment of when Jesus heard about the death of his cousin, John the Baptist. It says immediately he withdrew and went to a solitary place. And even when he re-entered ministry shortly after, he didn't re-enter ministry full force. He delegated for his disciples to feed the 5,000 plus people, right? He allowed other people's gifts to come up so that he had space and room to grieve. So I think sometimes we miss the fact that we're grieving many things, not just one. We grieve, all of us, in many different ways. And then third, I would say, sometimes we need to grieve before we get to the thing. And so we understand that those who are caring for family members with terminal illness are in a grief process before a person transitions or dies. But we don't often think about that as leaders, that we are often grieving when we are approaching seasons or moments that we are dreading. So we don't necessarily name dread as grief, but sometimes we reach moments where the loss of one more minute, the loss of one more emotional second causes grief. One more area that I think we miss in grief as leaders is the change in habits. So even as we start this process of leaning into Sabbath, leaning into soul and self-care, the habits that we had, sometimes we have to grieve the loss of those in order to gain others. So grief is like a continuous, constant part of our life in different levels that we don't always name. And if we aren't attentive to it regularly, this pain that comes with loss, I think sometimes we can miss it and not grieve it in a healthy way.
Thank you for those insights. That is so interesting to hear. And it really makes me think about, as this pandemic has occurred and continued, the loss that all of us have felt of lots of different things that were normal, right? And those habits you talked about, things we were used to doing that now are different, especially from a faith leader perspective. If your organization, your facility has been closed because of the pandemic, not being able to see your members or your parishioners and not being able to have that interaction, I imagine that is a huge sense of loss and leads into this. If then we're not following the grieving process or giving ourselves time for that, how impactful that can be to each of us.
Yes.
So thinking about that, how do we make the space for our own grief then as we are present with the grief of others?
Well, present is a key word, right? So we always teach in mental, emotional, and spiritual care that when grief is holy ground, it's sacred space. So grief is a very isolating and lonely experience, but so there's nothing anyone can really say in the moment per se that can take the pain away. And so what we do is we do a ministry of presence. And so just as you are present with other people in the midst of their pain, allow others to be present with you. I would also invite leaders to understand that we don't have to check our grief at the door when we enter in. Another reminder that I have is when Lazarus dies, Mary and Martha, who are in very intimate relationship with Jesus, are disappointed and pained, in addition to the death of their brother, that Jesus didn't show up, right? They didn't feel like Jesus showed up on time. And when he comes, Mary lights into him, right? Mary goes in. She's like, if you had been here, right? So she's angry. She's continuing to engage Jesus around her grief. And the passage says that when Jesus sees her grief and the grief of others, Jesus does what? Jesus weeps. So even though Jesus knows Lazarus is about to be raised from the dead, Jesus pauses in that moment, honors their pain, and is fully present with it and cries with them. He doesn't hide his grief. He doesn't check his grief at the door. He allows his grief to be with theirs, that we don't have to give that up. So I think one thing to remember is that we don't have to check our grief at the door to be present with someone else's. We can grieve alongside people. But I think the second thing that we need to remember is that joy and sorrow are two sides of the same coin. So I'm out of the Black church tradition. And so you see this happening a lot of times in Black worship. what may begin as a praise or a shout opens and breaks something up in us bodily and spiritually that allows the lament to come out. So grief is what we feel, lament is how we respond, right? And sometimes in worship, it'll start as a lament. I am crying, I'm wailing, I am sad, I am mourning. And because then that is able to release, it frees us for praise and joy. So just because we're grieving, it doesn't mean that we just have to sit in it. We move in and out. And so we don't have to deny joy in our life just to grieve, nor do we have to deny grief in our life just to have joy, but we oscillate. They can coexist. It's both and. And so you allow them to dance together and be together and don't push one out for the other. They're two sides of the same coin.
Again, such an interesting insight. And even as I think about it, and the way that my church and faith practice breaks up the church year, when I think about Lent and the, thinking about all the events that led up to Jesus' death on the cross, all of that sort of sorrow along with that. But then what does it result in? Of course, it's the resurrection and the Easter joy that comes right after that, right? And to your point,
it's a cycle.
Absolutely. And to be able to really enjoy the full amount of joy that comes with the resurrection, we have to remember what led up to that and what was that sacrifice.
That's right.
Great insights. One more question for you. What are some ways then that we can attend to our grief? I got to believe that many of the faith leaders that are here are thinking about that they need to be strong in front of their organizations and congregations, right? But I'm guessing you've got some good pointers for them on this.
Well, I would invite us as leaders, one, to know that a part of our work as leaders is also to model vulnerability, right? So I think that's important. So in addition to a weekly Sabbath, which we all need, right? So much that God didn't need it, but God modeled it. God commanded it, right? So we need this weekly Sabbath, but I will also invite people into what I call Sabbath moments, right? Grief pops up and it's in and out, right? And sometimes it's over a long period of time. There are people who have died in my life who I will never stop grieving. It just evolves. And so as you need to grieve, I would say have Sabbath moments. Take some time, close the door, have small practices that will allow you to attend to what you're feeling and engage your full self. I also encourage bodily practice. So I do a lot of visual and bodily prayer and lament. So there are times where words and language just cannot speak to the depth of pain and hurt that we are feeling. And so whether that is envisioning what you're feeling as a color and allowing the light of God to come in and just be with it, hold it, engulf it, that's visual prayer. Or whether you just move your body, right, in response to the pain, to the tension, until you feel enough release, this kind of bodily lament and prayer. But then you have practices that I think are just proven that many people do: journaling and reflection, letter writing, right? Write letters of loss to those who have died or to the things that you have lost. Like, what do you want to say? What do you really want to articulate that maybe you didn't have an opportunity to? Forms of creativity. And as always, and I think it's been named here, and it is a mainstay, to not be in isolation. So if you don't have clergy and leader groups that you're a part of, you want to pray and consider, who are the people who can hold me up, or who are your confidants? Invite people in so that you aren't an island. And if necessary, do grief counseling. It's okay to be able to do this, but that as we do this and as we heal, we're also modeling and giving other people permission, because we reproduce who we are as leaders, which means that if we aren't allowing space for our own grief, we're telling other people they shouldn't allow space for their grief.
Wow, such great information. Thank you so much, Reverend. We'll be back to you as well, I'm sure, as we start to look at the live Q&A. Our last panelist then is Reverend Jan Holton. Reverend, would you please take some time to give us a little bit of your background, and then I've got a set of questions for you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you so much, all of you, for the invitation, and so glad to join my colleagues here and talking about this really important topic. I teach pastoral care and counseling at Duke Divinity School. I have background research in examining communities in crisis, in conflict zones, and exploring how faith serves as a resource of resilience in those difficult circumstances, as well as in chaplaincy. So that's where I come from.
Well, it's so wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much for being here. My first question for you really dovetails and builds on some of the conversation we've already had. Why do you think it can be difficult for religious leaders in particular to engage in self-care?
Yeah, this is a huge question I've been really exploring a lot lately. Self-care is a complicated matter, right? And I agree completely in terms of what Sheila had said about it being understood often as a surface kind of practice, when in truth, it is foundational to finding our spiritual selves and to grounding ourselves and opening ourselves for connection to God. I think that how we interpret who we are as religious leaders and as people of faith, even what our sacred texts tell us about who that is, help form some narratives about who we should be as religious leaders. And Edward Wimberly, a pastoral theologian, talked about these in terms of myths, and that we need to reauthor some of these myths. These myths of ministry include the myth of self-sufficiency, right? That says, I need to do everything myself. And that means that I can't ask for help, right? Another one is this sort of myth of over-functioning. That's, I'm the only one who can do everything. And that means I'm the only one who can help, right? The myth of the under-functioner. And that this is a place of coming out of a lot of woundedness. Many people come to ministry through trauma and through some really difficult paths. And this is one that says, I'm not worthy of help, right? I'm not able to. And then there's a myth of like that we should sacrifice joy. That there is some element of being in ministry that should be about struggle and suffering and sadness. And in this way, I shouldn't ask for any help, right? And then finally, there's a myth of pleasing, right? That says that it's the need to please. And when we're in that place, it's a risk, really, to stop standing in that place of being overwhelmed. So I think maybe one of our tasks as religious leaders is to see, where do we find ourselves in this, and how is that reinforced not only in my interpretation of my faith, but how my family has help shape that in me. And we'll see the same thing reflected in those to whom we offer care as well.
Thank you so much for that explanation of those various myths. I can imagine that folks that might have some of those thoughts or ideas in their mind view any of their struggles as something they just need to push through for their organizations. But what's the cost of that, of pushing through when really the resources, whether they're physical or emotional or spiritual, are depleted?
Well, that's a huge question, isn't it? And I'm guessing that most all of us can admit to a time when we've had to push through. And, there are times when we just have to do that. It's the sustained belief that we just have to keep pushing through without rest or respite, where it becomes a wounding place as rather than a resourceful place. So I think there are many costs to it. But first, I would say is, Barbara McClure, another pastoral theologian, talks about unflourishing. I like that word, unflourishing. That's the cost to our health, our mental health, our physical health, our overall well-being, and it's substantial, right? I think most people going through this year have started to see those physical costs of what it means just to keep going. The second, I think, are moral implications, right? And saying no is one of the most important things we can do. And when we don't, and we just keep pushing through, our boundaries become very distorted. And it's all too easy to make lapses in judgment. So it's as much a safety issue. And that's a place of, one of our mandates is do no harm. And that pushing through compromises that, or can compromise that. And third, I would say, it impacts our spiritual lives deeply. I think first, it undermines our ability to cultivate joy. Now, I talk about joy not as an emotional state, but as a spiritual disposition that can be cultivated and should be over time, that can coexist with struggle and even with suffering, because it's our groundedness in God that gives us that place of joy. It forecloses on horizons of imagination. Now, this might seem a little bit outside of the conversation, but it really isn't. Imagination is fundamental to who we are as spiritual creatures, right? It's our ability to live creatively, to feel God's presence and to respond creatively to that. It's deeply a part of how we engage a prophetic vision. Right? To be able to imagine the horizons to which God's calling us, it's essential to our ability to move toward justice, to be able to imagine change in the world around us, the ability to hope. Right? If we cannot imagine what's ahead, the possibilities of that, we have ceased hoping, right? The ability to even hope. And I think to even engage in faith itself, to believe in the God beyond all things, to believe that anything is possible, even when we cannot see evidence of it in front of us. And I think that's a huge cost and a tragic one.
And that is a long list of costs. And I will say the one that really caught my ear, maybe isn't surprising being in insurance and in risk control, was that moral cost that you talked about. That really hadn't occurred to me before. As you were saying that, though, I started to think about we as human creatures, right? When we feel we're pushing through and we're sacrificing and we're giving, there's always that temptation out there to say, but now that means I deserve something, right? And maybe I deserve something out of the offering plate, or I deserve something that isn't part of my normal office in the organization, right? And creating those moral implications. And I agree with you that as those costs build up and as we become more and more depleted, it's more and more difficult to resist those temptations, right? So, boy, thank you so much for shedding light on those things. Now, of course, when we kind of talk about what costs are, then we really want to talk about how do we avoid those things. So basic practices, the resources for that idea of resilience in the lives of our religious leaders.
Yeah, we've touched on so many of them already, but first let me define resilience if I can, because I struggle some with the idea that resilience is just bouncing back as if we haven't been touched or impacted by whatever we've been through. First of all, I don't think it's possible. And I don't think it's good, right? I think we should be changed and we should grow out of whatever circumstances we encounter. So I use I've used it. It's not originally mine. I think it was Gina O'Connell Higgins who talks about this first, but I use it liberally, though noting her name. And that is resilience as struggling well. We all struggle. We're human beings. We are always going to struggle. Now, minimizing struggle, that's fair, but to expect that we're not going to have struggle is just it's not possible. So if we can learn to use our resources to struggle well, then I think that is what it is to live in a resilient way and to navigate times of difficulty, to navigate ministries well. when I think about how to do that, I kind of put it into 3 categories, some of which also we've already talked about: recover, restore, and reimagine. Now, recover is to seek professional help when we need it. We've already touched on that. Whether it's a physician, whether it's a psychologist, spiritual direction, don't be afraid or resistant to move into that. That too is a part of being resilient. It's not giving up, it's using your resources well. But restoring, and this is one, my gosh, I've been working so hard on myself. It is really hard. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking about perfection. I'm really talking about attention and being persistent with practices of things like these very basic things. Sleep. Sleep. It is the foundation of the pyramid. It impacts the way we think and how we feel, our health, and how we can connect to God, believe it or not. Again, one of the things we've already talked about: Sabbath time, prayer, intentional time with God, eating well, moving. Not exercise is great. If you run 10 miles, terrific. Just move in ways that fill you with happiness and move you toward joyfulness. And community, connecting with others. And then I would say the practices of reimagination are the ones that both of you have talked, that Donna spoke. Who was talking about journaling? I'm sorry, I forgot who was talking about that. Journaling and all kinds of ways of moving into oneself, but expressing oneself also. Yoga, centering prayer, art, dance, music. Now, again, I just want to kind of close with saying that we often think about that we need to start practices. All right, 5 days a week, here we go. I'm going to do this. Well, if we pick 1 hour in one day, I'm all about lowering the bar when it comes to these things. Maybe not forever, but to start off with, make it reasonable and attainable so that we can begin to live into this promise that comes with creating new habits that help us to thrive and to move toward well-being spiritually and physically and mentally.
Thank you so much for those best practices. And again, to all of the panelists, thank you for those introductory remarks, for indulging those questions. I think we're off to a great start here, and I see lots of questions in our Q&A. So we're going to transition over to taking some of those questions. Just as a reminder for folks, we are planning on finishing up at the top of the hour. So we've just got about 20 minutes or so left here, but we'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can. So I'm going to jump right in with one of these that sounds very interesting. So the question is, as a pastor, some leaders in my church do not understand the stresses on pastors, on that office. And for this particular person, a part of their structure, meaning their governance structure, called pastors to take better care of themselves by suggesting that they take a week to recharge, not as a vacation, right, but to recharge. I would dare say some of that restore type of activity that we talked about. But the leaders in this person's particular organization asked the pastor, what was the bishop thinking in terms of giving that direction? Because pastors have enough time off with the pandemic, right? What else are they doing? Sometimes I hear the joke going on, pastors only work 1 day a week anyway, right? What are they doing the other 6 days? So the person asking the question said, no amount of explanation seems to help them understand. How do I say no to them without creating more stress? So I think it was a Reverend Battle where we were having that conversation, or was it Sheila? I don't remember. I'm sorry. In terms of, Sheila, it was actually you, right? In terms of it's okay to say no. What are your thoughts here, maybe to start us off, and then we can get everyone in on this, but how do we say no without creating more stress?
So I think and I do think that this bleeds well with what Reverend Battle was talking about, but there is a certain amount of self-autonomy and permission that you have to give yourself around taking care of yourself that's not negotiable. And even if you are in structures of power, there still has to be a boundary set around you where decisions are made that are in your best interest. And I think that as pastors and as leaders, a lot of times we forfeit that right to self-care. We forfeit that in the name of wanting to align well with our upline, wanting to make sure that we are available for our parishioners and the community. But there is no progressive, sustainable, robotic way to live. Something's going to break down, something's going to crash, and it doesn't have to be you. I think one of the things that we've been really helping leaders understand is that that's why that sense of community that Dr. Holton was talking about is so important, so that you don't just offshoot these decisions without a collective voice. So what we teach is who's your Trinity and who's your tribe, right? So if Jesus had Peter, James, and John, who are your Peter, James, and John? And then who's your tribe? Who sits at the table of your life? And if all of these are helping to inform decisions you make, helping to inform what you say yes to and what you say no to, it's not a no alone. It's a collective no. It's your tribe. It's your Trinity saying, we see you and you need rest. We see you. We want you to take better care of yourself. Like Dr. Holton was said, this whole eat, sleep, move is the simplest of things, and yet it's the hardest to do. And so if you are a lay leader or a pastor and you're married and your wife is saying, come on, honey, let's go for a walk. That's part of your Trinity saying, I see you, I want to support you, I want you to be healthy, I want you to take care of yourself. And so some of that risk that you're taking with the no is worth it, because what it's costing you isn't worth it. And when you have that community of support between your Trinity and your tribe, you don't stand alone making those decisions. You stand in a collective space that's loved and supported by other people, so that you don't have to make those decisions alone.
All right, that's great advice. Reverend Battle, any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, just briefly, because I think that what was just said was power. Okay. I would just say that this is one of those times where unnamed grief comes up, right? That potentially entering a conversation like this, or the thought of having to go back to a conversation like this, like it's the loss of your personhood, right? Like this loss of not being seen, it's the invisibility of it. And that can create grief. And so what might it look like to have a process where you're attending to how this makes you angry, right? The Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. How does this make you angry, right? How does this bring sadness for you, that your leaders can't understand and support you in this? You've already gone back and explained. So you've already been in the bargaining phase of this, right? And the denial phase. So you step through all of these things and you invite God in to say, okay, now help me accept that it's okay for me to still say no, even if the leaders don't understand why I need this. Right? So this grief is about accepting that people may not be pleased with your choice, and that's okay. So you can grieve the lack of their pleasure and let it go.
More great advice. Thank you so much. Dr. Holton, anything else to add on there?
I like that so much. Thank you. I would just add one thing. I do sometimes think it's very hard for, I don't want to oversympathize in this, but I think it is sometimes hard for congregations to understand what the life of a pastor is, right? I mean, maybe they only come on Sunday. That's all they see. Certainly, we think they should know more of what a really exhausting week of pastoring looks like, but maybe they don't. On the other hand, we don't want to feel like we have to defend everything we do in order to defend that we need care. So that's a tough thing to work out. But the other thing I would say is that this practice begins as soon as we enter into a new congregation, right? We begin to teach them, I have this day off, and this is so that I can be of better service to you because I need to take care of myself. And it is hard to come in at a later date and start new practices. They're going to have to get used to it, just like you will, building the habit. So it's just going to have to get used to people, like you said, not being happy sometimes, but you must take care of yourself.
Right. Thank you so much. This next question, I think we'll start with Reverend Battle on this one. It goes right to some of the topics that you talked about as the intro. How do you know that you're not tending to your grief?
Well, one, if you haven't made intentional space for your grief, you're not attending to your grief. So that's one, right? Have I made space for it? I think another way that we know is in community, right? I think our sister Battle here, she laid it out, right? Who is your Trinity? Who's your tribe? Like, how are you inviting people to have permission to speak, to name for you what you can't see, to call you back to say, hey, what's happening? Like, I'm a little worried, right? Have you given people explicit permission to do that so that when you are in a zone and you can't see it, you know you have people who are backing you, who are going to name that for you, right? Do you have emotions that creep up that you just, all of your practices, they won't do them away, right? Like you get a little bit here, and they just keep creeping up. That means you need to stop and slow down, right? It's time to stop. Because remember, grief is about a complete stop in most cases, outside of just your regular Sabbath time. I would also say that a broader understanding of whether or not you're attending to your grief would be, as a leader, am I the one that everyone depends on? Like, have I made space, as Dr. Holton was referring to earlier, have I made space in the way that I lead for other people to show up for folk, right? For other gifts to be cultivated, so that the culture of my community is such that the expectation is not that I'm the only one who can or will show up. So that when I need to step back, right, there's space for it. And so if there's no room for it, and every time you need to step away, particularly for grief or anything, you have this anxiety that rises. I can't because I have X, Y, and Z. That also means that you're probably not getting the space you need because the environment has not been cultivated for you to be able to stop and walk away.
Thank you so much. And as oh, sorry, Sheila, did you have something you wanted to add into there?
Just add something foundational underneath all of that. One of the reasons why people can't identify their grief is because they can't name it. And so we as human beings don't innately know how to wrap language around how we feel. And in the circles in which we live, if someone says, how are you doing? You say, oh, I'm blessed, or I'm highly favored, but those aren't feelings. And so we use Gloria Wilcox's feeling wheel to help people identify and wrap language around their emotions and how they're actually feeling, so that we get out of saying habitual responses and that we're authentic and honest. And so I think if you can name your sadness, if you can name your grief, if you can name your joy, if you can name your powerful emotions, if you can name them and put words to them and make them part of your regular vernacular, then big words like grief don't fall on you and topple you over, because you're already in a space where you cultivate good emotional language and you're able to express where you are, how you're feeling, and then you can communicate what you need. So I don't think you can get to talking about grief until you can at first admit you're sad, or first admit there's a loss, because Reverend Battle nailed it. Grief isn't about death, it's about loss. And so when we start calculating out all of the losses of 2020 and before, until we can name it and say, I'm disappointed, I'm angry, I'm bargaining, whatever the emotions are, say what they are. And then you can slide into healing. Then you can step into spaces and heal and do the inner work on that.
Thank you, Sheila. And while we have you on the screen, there's a question that's getting some attention here with some additional votes for you. And I think you just kind of touched on it a little bit. So I'm going to jump in with this question and ask you, is there a manual that you use to help people with soul care?
Yeah, so we're in publication right now. 15 Minutes of Grace came out a couple of years ago, but what we're in publication for now is the Emotional Wellness Toolkit. And so in that, all of the things that Reverend Battle and Dr. Holt and Dr. Battle have all talked about, all of those components are in there. And the key is consistency, that you do it when you feel like it and when you don't. You don't just brush your teeth before you go to the dentist. You brush your teeth every day. And so if you have a toolkit filled with different practices, you can pull out of there what you need for the day. Like Dr. Holton said, it's not about saying, I'm going to sit for an hour, I'm going to pray for an hour. It's about how do you engage in practices that cultivate your own wellness. And so our foundational practice is 15 minutes of grace, where you sit in silence for 15 minutes and you do not judge, condemn, or compare yourself for 15 minutes. And it sounds easy, but it can be a challenge. And it's a practice, and it takes practice, right? And so it's not about these large, labor-intensive things. It's the small things that you can do daily that aid and mature your emotional wellness. And so, yes, we are working on that. It is in publication, and I'm certain that it will go out as soon as it's on Amazon and everywhere where you can get it. But it is the Emotional Wellness Toolkit.
Thank you so much. And as I'm seeing the time here, and we've got lots of questions out there that are great. Well, of course, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But I do want to let you know that what we'll try to do for any questions that we aren't able to answer, we will try to reach out to answer them through a future email, and we'll solicit help from the panelists in doing that. My next question, I think, is Dr. Holton. You're probably the best one to start with this one. How do you deal with those myths that you mentioned that are encoded into the institution? So, as an example, when speaking of seeking to protect family time and being told that a previous pastor didn't know his kids because he was so busy being a pastor, and they turned out all right. So you need to understand that your time with your family will go away, and you will just have to learn to accept that. So, wow, that's a big statement from a member there. But many congregations have been trained to expect their pastors to do everything for them, regardless of any other needs. How do we tackle those kinds of things?
Right. Well, those are other kinds of myths that congregations create, hold on to, and expect others to live into. And I think one of the points that Dr. Wimberly was talking about when he was talking about this is reauthoring myths. And just like we need to be responsible for reauthoring ours, sometimes with help, because, the myths that we live into, they're not only how we interpret scripture, but they also come from our families, from how we've been taught to understand who we are in the world and what we can do, what we should do, all of those types of things. And they're imposed socially and culturally as well, also. So, it is partly helping members, and I would say not individuals, because sometimes people are just going to be unhappy. It's a sad thing, but they just will be. And we do have to contend with it. It doesn't make life easier. But as a community, is to infuse that community with a sense of empowerment, to begin to envision what ministry looks like for everyone, right? It's not just a pastor who is caring for the congregation, but a community is caring for each other. And maybe as that begins, that as they start to see that caring for themselves and caring for each other requires habits of care and reimagining expectations, that we can begin to do that also for the pastor. Now, I am aware this is one of the most difficult things to do in a congregational community. I mean, it is. So I don't have fast answers here, but I do think that's what it is. I think we can begin to help communities care for each other and reimagine what that looks like. Then they can begin to reimagine what the pastor's role is and begin to accept that there are some differences. That's not a specific answer to this one particular situation about, that's kind of that's a difficult image to deal with, but there you go. That would be my suggestion, which is hard to do, but it's well worth it.
Well, your answer actually leads into, I think, what's going to be our last question. And this one will have to be a little bit quick, but I'd like an input from each of our panelists on this one. Lack of community has been a real problem during the pandemic. How can we navigate that lack of good community outside of our congregations? So, Dr. Holton, I see you're off mute. You want to start with that one? We have to go kind of quick, though, on this one.
Sorry, I forgot to put the mute back on. Yeah, I think it is make community wherever you can in small bits or large, right? I I believe that I know Zoom is not great. It's not ideal. And we miss being next to each other and hugging each other. But do that, people far and near, connect in whatever way possible until we are fully back together around each other in person, which will happen again in any way we can, whatever your context.
Thank you, Dr. Holton. Reverend Battle?
Yeah, no, I would ditto that. I think that's exactly it in any way that we possibly can. Some of the ways that I've seen people do it is, they meet for a walk and a talk. Gather folk where you don't have to spend a lot of time planning a program or doing anything. So whether it's for you or whether it's for the congregation, to do things, get outside where it's a bit safer. If people still want to wear masks, they can, but just have meetup times and let people just come and be in the presence of one another and enjoy one another.
Thank you so much. Sheila, you get the final word on this one.
I hate to sound like a broken record. I just think you have to model it. If you model it, then the people have an image and a vision to follow. Find your tribe, find your Trinity, and model that in front of your faith community, and they'll follow.
Great advice from all of our panelists today. I want to take time to thank you so very much for being here with us. Also want to thank our partners. So Church Mutual, thanks for being a part of this. Thank you for letting me be a part of this. Duke Divinity and the Balm and Gilead, so much. Thank you for helping put this together. Of course, there's all those folks behind the scenes, the ones that are taking care of the technology for us and making this all work. We thank you so much for all of them. And we thank you, the attendees. Thank you for being here. We hope that you've heard some good pieces of information today that you can take back and that you can implement and work on that soul care that Sheila told us about from the beginning. A recording of the event and a survey will be emailed to you shortly. So I imagine that's a link to the recording that you'll be able to get to that. And then please, if you would, please complete that survey. That really helps us to make sure that we're doing the best we can with these type of events. As Rich mentioned earlier, this is really one in a series. So look for other information on more of these types of events coming your way. And for everyone that's out there, please have a blessed day. And thank you again for attending.